Chapter 1: The Welcome Wagon. The morning mist clung to Pine Ridge National Park like gossamer threads, weaving between ancient pines that had witnessed more than any living soul should remember. Ranger Marcus Webb stood at the entrance gate, his weathered hands clasping a steaming cup of coffee as the first visitor of the day approached. His uniform was pristine despite decades of wear, and his eyes held a peculiar vitality that seemed at odds with the deep lines etched around them. Sarah Chen pulled her beaten Honda Civic to a stop beside the ranger station. Through her rolled-down window, she could smell the crisp mountain air mixed with something else, something that reminded her of old museums and forgotten places. Webb approached with a practiced smile that never quite reached those strangely bright eyes. "Welcome to Pine Ridge," he said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had greeted thousands of visitors over the years. "First time here?" Sarah nodded, pushing a strand of black hair behind her ear. "Yeah, I'm from Portland. Needed to get away for a while, clear my head." Webb's smile deepened slightly. Running from something or running to something? The question caught her off guard. Most park rangers stuck to asking about camping permits and fire safety. I guess. Running from. Lost my job last month, and my lease is up next week. Figured I'd spend some time hiking before I figure out what comes next. "No family expecting you back?" Sarah shook her head. "My parents died in a car accident 2 years ago. I'm pretty much on my own these days." Something flickered in Webb's eyes, like a candle flame disturbed by an unfelt breeze. "Well, you've come to the right place for solitude. Pine Ridge has a way of helping people find what they're looking for." He leaned closer to her window, and Sarah caught a whiff of something musty emanating from his uniform. Like dried flowers or old parchment. "I've been the ranger here for, longer than most people remember. Seen a lot of folks pass through these woods." "Must be a rewarding job," Sarah said, though something in his tone made her skin prickle. "Oh, it has its rewards," Webb replied, his hand unconsciously moving to touch a small leather pouch hanging from his belt. The pouch made a soft rattling sound, like dice or small stones. "I collect things, you see, remnants, evidence of the lives that have touched this place." Sarah glanced at the pouch curiously. "Like what kind of things?" "Bones, mostly," Webb said matter-of-factly. "Animal bones, of course. You'd be amazed what you find out there in the deep woods. Deer skulls bleached white by years of weather, bird bones delicate as lace, sometimes the complete skeleton of a fox or raccoon. Nature has such beautiful ways of preserving what matters." The way he said it made Sarah's stomach flutter uncomfortably, but she forced a smile. "That's interesting. Like a hobby?" "More than a hobby," Webb said, his fingers still playing with the rattling pouch. "It's a calling, you might say. The bones tell stories, if you know how to listen. They remember things. Important things." A cool breeze stirred the trees around them, and Sarah suddenly felt eager to be moving, to put some distance between herself and the ranger's intense gaze. "Well, I should probably get going. Need to find a good campsite before dark." "Of course," Webb said, stepping back from her car. "Might I suggest the Whispering Creek area? About 5 miles up the main trail, then a 1/4 mile east along the creek bed. Very secluded, perfect for someone who wants to be undisturbed." He handed her a park map, his fingers lingering a moment longer than necessary when they touched hers. His skin was surprisingly cold despite the warm morning. "Just follow the trail markers. And Sarah?" She looked up at him in surprise, not remembering giving him her name. "If you hear anything unusual at night, don't go investigating alone. The woods here are old, and old places sometimes hold on to things that are better left sleeping." As Sarah drove away, She glanced in her rearview mirror to see Webb still standing by the gate, watching her car disappear around the bend. He was writing something in a small notebook, and even from a distance, she could see that strange, ageless smile still playing at the corners of his mouth. The leather pouch at his belt continued its soft rattling in the morning breeze, like bones whispering secrets to the wind. Chapter 2. Lost Signals. A week had passed since Sarah's arrival when Jake Morrison pulled his motorcycle into the same parking area, the engine's rumble echoing off the surrounding peaks before falling silent. He sat for a moment, removing his helmet and running grimy fingers through unwashed brown hair. The bike was loaded with everything he owned, which wasn't much anymore. 3 months since he dropped out of college, 2 months since his father had thrown him out, and 4 weeks since he'd stopped returning his mother's increasingly frantic phone calls. Webb materialized from the ranger station as if he'd been expecting him. "Afternoon," the ranger called out, his voice carrying that same warm authority Sarah had encountered. "Planning to stay the night?" Jake shrugged, shouldering his worn backpack. "Maybe a few nights. Haven't decided yet." "Running from something or running to something?" Webb asked, the exact same question he'd posed to Sarah, though Jake had no way of knowing this. "Neither," Jake lied. "Just traveling." Webb studied him with those peculiarly bright eyes, taking in the unkempt appearance, the defensive posture, the way Jake avoided direct eye contact. "Family know where you are?" Jake's laugh was bitter. "Family doesn't give a damn where I am. Made that pretty clear." "Friends, then?" "Don't really have any of those either." The admission came out more pathetic than Jake had intended, and he felt his cheeks burn with embarrassment. Webb's smile widened almost imperceptibly. "Well, you're welcome here as long as you follow park regulations. Pine Ridge has a way of providing exactly what people need." His hand moved to the leather pouch at his belt, producing that same soft rattling sound. "I was just about to make my evening rounds. Care to join me? I could show you some good camping spots." Something about the offer felt off to Jake, but he couldn't put his finger on what. Maybe it was the way Webb's eyes seemed to gleam in the fading daylight, or the way his smile never seemed to change, regardless of what he was saying. "I can find my own spot, thanks." "Suit yourself," Webb said, though his tone suggested mild disappointment. "But if you change your mind, I'll be making camp near Deadfall Canyon tonight, about 3 miles north on the old logging road. Sometimes it's nice to have company when the woods get active." "Active?" Webb's fingers continued to worry the leather pouch, the rattling growing more pronounced. "These mountains are old, son. Older than the trees, older than the native tribes that used to consider this place sacred. Sometimes at night, you can hear them whispering. The bones of the earth itself, singing songs that were old when the first humans learned to fear the dark." Jake stared at him, uncertain whether the ranger was being poetic or just plain weird. "Right. Well, I'll keep that in mind." He found a campsite 2 miles up the main trail, a small clearing beside a burbling stream that seemed isolated enough for his purposes. As darkness fell, Jake built a small fire and heated a can of beans over the flames. The woods around him were alive with night sounds, the usual symphony of crickets and owls and rustling leaves that he'd grown accustomed to during his weeks on the road. It was just past midnight when he heard the footsteps. They were soft, deliberate, circling his camp at a distance just beyond the reach of his firelight. Jake sat up in his sleeping bag, straining his ears. The footsteps paused, then resumed, closer now. He could hear something else too, a soft rhythmic sound like maracas or wind chimes. "Hello?" he called out, his voice cracking slightly. "Someone there?" The footsteps stopped immediately, but the rattling continued for several seconds before falling silent. Jake waited, hardly breathing, but heard nothing more. Eventually, He convinced himself it had been an animal, maybe a raccoon investigating his food stores. But when morning came and he examined the area around his camp, he found a set of boot prints in the soft earth near the stream. Human prints, size 11 or 12, with a distinctive wear pattern on the left heel. Beside one of the clearest prints was a small white object that made Jake's blood run cold. It was a human tooth, yellowed with age, with the root still attached. Jake packed his gear with shaking hands, but as he prepared to leave, Ranger Webb emerged from the tree line as if he'd been waiting there all along. The man looked exactly as he had the day before, his uniform spotless despite supposedly spending the night in the wilderness. "Morning, Jake," Webb said pleasantly. "How did you sleep?" "Fine," Jake lied, shoving the tooth deep into his pocket. "Just fine." Webb's eyes seemed to sparkle with amusement. "Good to hear. These old woods can be unsettling for newcomers. All sorts of things buried out here over the years. Indian burial grounds, old mining camps, places where people have been forgotten." The leather pouch at Webb's belt looked fuller than it had the day before, and when he moved, the rattling was more pronounced, almost musical. Jake found himself staring at it, wondering what could possibly make that sound. "You know," Webb continued, "I found some interesting specimens during my rounds last night. Bone fragments near an old campsite. Probably animal remains, but you can never be sure. Would you like to see them?" Every instinct Jake possessed screamed at him to refuse, to get on his bike and ride away as fast as possible. But something about Webb's tone, something almost hypnotic in those ageless eyes, made him nod against his better judgment. "Excellent," Webb said, his smile growing wider. "Why don't you follow me? I know a place where we won't be disturbed." As they walked deeper into the woods, Jake's cell phone lost its last bar of signal, the screen going dark as they moved beyond the reach of civilization. Behind them, his abandoned campsite grew smaller and smaller until the trees swallowed it completely, leaving no trace that Jake Morrison had ever existed at all. Chapter 3: The Helpful Stranger. The rain began as a gentle mist, but quickly escalated into a torrential downpour that turned the forest floor into a treacherous maze of mud and hidden roots. Melissa Hartwell stumbled through the undergrowth, her thin jacket providing little protection against the elements. At 17, she was small for her age, with hollow cheeks and eyes that had seen too much too young. The bruises on her arms had faded to yellow-green, but the memories they represented were still vivid. She'd been walking for 3 days since fleeing her stepfather's house, living on convenience store snacks and sleeping in bus station bathrooms. Pine Ridge had seemed like a good place to disappear, somewhere she could think without the constant fear of Larry's heavy footsteps on the stairs outside her bedroom. When Ranger Webb appeared through the curtain of rain like some kind of woodland spirit, Melissa's first instinct was to run. Authority figures had never meant safety in her world. But she was cold, exhausted, and desperate enough to take a chance on the kind-faced man in the ranger uniform. "Good Lord, child," Webb said, his voice filled with what sounded like genuine concern. "You're soaked to the bone. What are you doing out here in this weather?" Melissa hugged her backpack closer to her chest, water dripping from her stringy blonde hair. "Just hiking." Webb studied her with those strangely bright eyes, taking in her inadequate clothing, her obvious exhaustion, the defensive way she held herself. "This is no weather for hiking, especially not alone. My cabin's just through those trees. Why don't you come warm up by the fire?" "I don't want any trouble," Melissa said quickly. "I'll just keep moving." "Trouble?" Webb laughed, and the sound was warm and reassuring. "Child, the only trouble you're in is hypothermia if you stay out in this storm. I've got hot soup and dry clothes. No strings attached." Something in his tone reminded Melissa of her elementary school principal, Mr. Henderson, the only adult who'd ever seemed to genuinely care about her welfare. Against her better judgment, she found herself nodding. Webb's cabin was a rustic structure that seemed to grow naturally from the forest floor, its logs dark with age and moisture. Smoke curled from the chimney, and warm yellow light spilled from the windows. It looked like something from a fairy tale, and Melissa felt some of the tension leave her shoulders as they approached. Inside, the cabin was exactly what she'd expected: heavy wooden furniture, Native American blankets draped over chairs, and shelves lined with books about forestry and wildlife management. What she hadn't expected was the collection of bones. They were everywhere. Deer skulls mounted on the walls, glass cases filled with delicate bird skeletons, and jars containing what looked like preserved specimens floating in clear liquid. The centerpiece was a massive display case containing a complete wolf skeleton, its jaw frozen in an eternal snarl. "Don't mind the collection," Webb said, noticing her stare. "Occupational hazard of spending so much time in the wilderness. You find things, and before you know it, you're a curator of the forest's history." He handed her a towel and gestured toward a chair near the fireplace. "Sit, I'll heat up some soup." As Melissa dried her hair, she couldn't help but continue staring at the bone collection. There was something mesmerizing about it, the way the firelight played across the bleached surfaces, casting dancing shadows on the cabin walls. Some of the specimens were clearly very old, while others looked recently acquired. "Find something interesting?" Webb asked, returning with a steaming bowl of vegetable soup. "You must have been collecting for a long time," Melissa said, accepting the bowl gratefully. "Oh, decades," Webb replied, settling into the chair across from her. At his belt, the leather pouch rattled softly as he moved. "Each piece tells a story. The life it lived, the way it died, the purpose it served. Bones are honest, you see. They don't lie or pretend to be something they're not." Melissa sipped the soup, feeling warmth spread through her body for the first time in days. "That's a weird way to think about it." "Is it?" Webb's eyes gleamed in the firelight. "Think about it. Flesh rots, skin wrinkles, organs fail, but bones endure. They're the truest part of any living thing, the foundation everything else is built on." He leaned forward slightly. "What's your foundation, Melissa?" She nearly choked on her soup. "How do you know my name?" Webb smiled that ageless smile. "Lucky guess. You look like a Melissa to me. Running from something, I'd say. Family trouble?" The concern in his voice was so genuine that Melissa found herself opening up despite her usual caution. "Stepfather," she said quietly. He's not a good person." "Ah." Webb nodded understandingly. "And your mother?" "She doesn't believe me. Or she doesn't want to." Melissa stared into her soup bowl. "I left her a note, but I doubt she'll even report me missing. Probably relieved I'm gone." "No other family? Friends who might be worried?" Melissa shook her head. "We moved a lot when I was younger. Never really had time to make friends. And my real dad died when I was 8. Webb's expression grew thoughtful, and his hand moved unconsciously to the leather pouch at his belt. The rattling was more pronounced now, almost rhythmic. "So you're completely on your own?" "Pretty much." "That must be terrifying." "It's better than staying," Melissa said firmly. "Oh, I'm sure it is." Webb's voice had taken on a different quality, something Melissa couldn't quite identify. "The question is, what happens next?" A 17-year-old girl alone in the world. That's a precarious position. The warmth from the soup was making Melissa drowsy, and she found it hard to focus on Webb's words. The rain continued to hammer against the cabin's windows, and the fire crackled hypnotically in the hearth. The bone collection seemed to shimmer in her peripheral vision, as if the specimens were moving slightly when she wasn't looking directly at them. "I'll figure something out," she said, though her voice sounded far away to her own ears. I'm sure you will. Webb stood and moved to one of his display cases, running his fingers along the glass surface. You know, I've been thinking about expanding my collection, adding some new pieces to commemorate the lives that have touched this place. He turned back to her, and for just a moment, his eyes seemed to glow with an inner light that had nothing to do with the fireplace. Would you like to see something special, Melissa? Something most visitors never get to experience. The soup bowl slipped from her numb fingers, clattering to the floor. Melissa tried to stand, but her legs wouldn't cooperate. The drowsiness was spreading through her entire body now, and she realized with growing horror that something had been wrong with the soup. What did you do to me? She whispered. Webb's smile never wavered. Just a little something to help you relax. You've been through so much trauma, so much pain. I'm going to help you find peace, Melissa. Eternal peace. He moved to a section of the cabin wall that looked like solid wood paneling, but when he pressed on it, it swung inward like a hidden door. Beyond was darkness so complete it seemed to swallow the light from the fireplace. Down there, Webb said softly, is where the real collection lives. Where the bones sing their ancient songs and hungry things wait to be fed. The leather pouch at his belt was rattling frantically now, as if whatever was inside was excited. Would you like to meet them, Melissa? They've been so lonely lately. As consciousness faded, Melissa's last coherent thought was that the bones in Webb's collection weren't all from animals. Some were too perfectly preserved, too specifically arranged. And in the growing darkness, she could swear she heard something calling to her from the hidden chamber beyond the door, something that sounded like voices whispering her name in languages that predated human speech. Chapter 4. The Bone Collector's Craft. Amy Rodriguez and Rick Chen had been living off the grid for 2 years, ever since the world had become too complicated and cruel for their idealistic hearts to bear. They traveled in a converted van painted with peace signs and Bob Marley lyrics, supporting themselves with Amy's macrame jewelry and Rick's acoustic guitar performances in whatever small towns would tolerate their presence. Pine Ridge represented everything they had been searching for: pristine wilderness, minimal human interference, and the kind of spiritual energy that seemed to emanate from truly ancient places. They had been camped at the same site for a week when Ranger Webb first approached them, emerging from the morning mist like a figure from a nature documentary. He'd seemed friendly enough, if a bit intense, checking their permits and offering advice about local wildlife. What had struck them as odd was how much he seemed to know about their personal situation. So you're completely self-sufficient, he'd observed, examining their solar panels and water filtration system. No family expecting you anywhere specific? That's the beauty of freedom, Rick had replied, his long hair tied back with a hemp cord. We go where the universe calls us. And the universe called you here. The energy is incredible. Amy had gushed, her tie-dyed dress fluttering in the breeze. You can feel the connection to something deeper, something more authentic than the artificial world we left behind. Webb had smiled that ageless smile. Oh, there's definitely something deeper here, something that's been waiting a very long time for the right kind of offering. They dismissed his cryptic comment as typical Ranger mysticism, the kind of thing you'd expect from someone who spent too much time alone in the wilderness. But over the following days, Webb had continued to visit their camp, always appearing at unexpected moments with an uncanny ability to approach without being heard. He gives me the creeps, Amy whispered to Rick on their 7th night as they sat around their campfire sharing a joint and watching the stars emerge overhead. There's something not right about him. He's just lonely, Rick replied, though he'd noticed Webb's strange habits too, the way the Ranger never seemed to eat or drink anything when he visited, the soft rattling sound that followed him wherever he went. The fact that his uniform was always spotless, despite his claims of spending days in the backcountry, probably hasn't had a real conversation with another human being in months. But did you see his eyes today, when I mentioned that nobody knows exactly where we are? They, lit up. Rick was about to respond when Webb materialized at the edge of their firelight, moving with the silent grace of a predator. "Evening, folks. Hope I'm not interrupting anything important." "Just enjoying the night," Rick said, discreetly stubbing out the joint. "Want to join us?" "Actually, I was hoping you might join me." Webb's hand moved to the leather pouch at his belt, which seemed fuller than usual. The rattling was more pronounced tonight, almost musical in its complexity. "I've discovered something remarkable. A place where the veil between worlds grows thin, where the ancient energies you've been sensing can be experienced directly." Amy felt a chill run down her spine that had nothing to do with the mountain air. "What kind of place?" "A sacred site, hidden deep in the old-growth forest where the first inhabitants of this land performed their most important ceremonies." Webb's eyes gleamed in the firelight, and for a moment they seemed to reflect the flames like an animal's. "It's about 5 miles from here, accessible only on foot. But I guarantee it will be the most spiritually transformative experience of your lives." Rick felt Amy's hand squeeze his arm in warning, but the promise of genuine spiritual enlightenment was too tempting to resist. They'd been searching for exactly this kind of authentic experience for so long. "When would we go?" he heard himself asking. "Now," Webb said simply. "The energies are strongest at night, when the barriers are weakest. Besides, it's better if we're not observed by other campers. Some people aren't ready for this level of spiritual truth." Every rational instinct Amy possessed screamed at her to refuse, but there was something compelling about Webb's invitation. Something that seemed to bypass her conscious mind and speak directly to deeper parts of her psyche. Before she knew it, she was nodding along with Rick. "Excellent," Webb said, his smile growing wider. "Bring only what you need for the journey. Where we're going, material possessions are meaningless anyway." They followed him into the forest along paths that seemed to exist only when Webb was leading them. The trees grew larger and more ancient as they traveled, their branches forming a canopy so thick that the starlight disappeared entirely. The only sounds were their footsteps on the soft earth and the constant rattling from Webb's pouch, which had taken on an almost hypnotic rhythm. "How much further?" Amy whispered after what felt like hours of walking. "We're almost there," Webb replied, though he showed no signs of fatigue despite the difficult terrain. "Tell me, what do you know about sacrifice?" The question came out of nowhere, and Rick stumbled slightly. "Sacrifice?" "The ancients understood that transformation requires surrender. To gain something of value, you must give up something of equal worth." Webb's voice had taken on a lecturing quality, as if he were reciting from memory. "The question is, what are you willing to sacrifice for true enlightenment?" "We've already sacrificed our old lives," Amy said, though her voice was shaking now. "Our jobs, our families, our security." "Ah, but those were just externals. Material things that were holding you back anyway." Webb stopped walking and turned to face them. In the absolute darkness beneath the ancient trees, his eyes were the only source of light, glowing with an inner radiance that definitely wasn't natural. "Real sacrifice involves giving up the one thing you can never get back." The leather pouch at his belt was rattling frantically now, and Rick could swear he heard voices whispering from inside it, speaking in languages that hurt his ears to hear. Amy grabbed his hand, her fingers ice cold despite the warm night. "I think we should go back," she whispered. "Oh, but we're so close," Webb said, his smile never wavering. "Just a few more steps, and you'll understand everything." You'll see the truth that lies beneath the surface of reality, the hungry things that wait in the spaces between worlds, and the price they demand for their gifts. Ahead of them, deeper in the forest, something vast and ancient stirred in response to Webb's words. Amy could feel it now, a presence so alien and malevolent that her mind recoiled from contact with it. Whatever had been sleeping in these woods, Webb's voice was calling it to wakefulness. "Run," she whispered to Rick, but found that her legs wouldn't obey. The rattling from Webb's pouch had become a symphony now, dozens of voices singing in harmony, and the sound was paralyzing her nervous system. "Too late for running," Webb said gently, "but don't worry. Your sacrifice will serve a greater purpose. The entities I serve are generous with their gifts, and I've earned myself centuries of life by feeding their hunger. Your bones will join the chorus, and your souls will nourish something far more magnificent than your individual consciousness ever could." In the darkness ahead, something that definitely wasn't human began to laugh. Chapter 5. Trophies in the Dark. David Martinez had driven across 3 states to reach Pine Ridge, his Honda Civic loaded with everything he owned after losing both his job and his apartment in the same disastrous week. At 32, he thought he had his life figured out, but the universe had other plans. His engineering position had been eliminated in corporate downsizing, his girlfriend had left him for someone with better prospects, and his few remaining friends had grown tired of his increasingly bitter complaints about the unfairness of it all. The national park represented a chance to reset, to figure out his next move without the constant reminders of his failures. He told no one where he was going, partly out of embarrassment and partly because there was no one left to tell. His parents had died years earlier, his sister lived in Europe and they barely spoke, and his former colleagues had stopped returning his calls weeks ago. Webb found him on his 3rd night, sitting alone by his campfire and nursing his 2nd bottle of wine. The ranger appeared at the edge of the firelight without warning, as if he'd materialized from the darkness itself. "Rough day?" Webb asked, noting the empty bottle beside David's chair. "Rough life," David replied, not bothering to hide his intoxication. He'd given up on maintaining appearances. "Sorry, officer. I know alcohol's probably not allowed in the park. I'm not here in an official capacity," Webb said, settling onto a log across from the fire. "Just making my rounds, checking on folks. These mountains can be lonely places, especially for someone carrying heavy burdens." Something in the ranger's tone made David look up. Webb was studying him with those peculiarly bright eyes, and his expression held what looked like genuine sympathy. "How did you know?" "Experience. I've been working these woods for longer than most people remember, and you develop an eye for recognizing pain." Webb's hand moved to the leather pouch at his belt, producing that soft, rattling sound David had noticed earlier. "Want to talk about it?" Maybe it was the wine, or maybe it was the simple fact that Webb was the first person to show him genuine interest in weeks, but David found himself opening up. He told the ranger about the job loss, the failed relationship, the growing sense that his life had been built on fundamentally unstable ground. Webb listened without judgment, occasionally nodding or making sympathetic sounds. "And there's nobody waiting for you back home?" Webb asked when David finished his story. "Nobody who'd miss me," David admitted. "I thought I had a support network, but it turns out most of my relationships were pretty superficial. When the chips were down, everyone just disappeared." "That's the modern world for you," Webb said with what sounded like genuine sadness. "People have forgotten how to form real connections. They're all too busy chasing material success to invest in anything meaningful." His fingers continued to work the leather pouch, and the rattling had taken on a rhythmic quality. "But you know what's interesting about isolation? It strips away all the pretense, reduces you to your essential self." "My essential self is apparently a complete failure," David said bitterly. Or maybe your essential self is something more valuable than you realize. Webb leaned forward, his eyes reflecting the firelight in an oddly hypnotic way. You know, I collect things. Remnants of lives that have touched this place, evidence of the journeys people have taken, the transformations they've undergone. He reached into the pouch and withdrew something small and white, turning it over in his fingers. In the flickering light, it took David a moment to realize what he was looking at. "Is that a bone?" he asked, squinting through his wine-induced haze. "Finger bone," Webb confirmed matter-of-factly. "Human, I'd say. Adult male, probably mid-30s based on the density and wear patterns." He held it up to catch the firelight. Found it near one of the old camping areas. Amazing how well preserved it is, considering how long it's probably been out there. David's stomach lurched, though he couldn't tell if it was from the wine or from something deeper. Shouldn't you report that to the authorities? If it's human remains. "Oh, I am the authorities here," Webb said with a chuckle. "And human bones aren't as uncommon as you might think. These mountains have been claiming lives for centuries. Native American burial sites, pioneer graves, hikers who got lost and never made it out. The wilderness doesn't distinguish between them. It just processes everything eventually." He dropped the bone back into the pouch, where it clinked against other objects with a sound like wind chimes. The fascinating thing is how each piece tells a story. The stress fractures speak of desperation. The tooth marks reveal final struggles. The way the marrow has been extracted suggests exactly how each life ended. "That's pretty morbid," David said, though he couldn't stop staring at the pouch. "Is it? Or is it just honest?" Webb's smile never wavered. "Death is the most natural thing in the world, the only guarantee any of us have. Everything else is just temporary distraction from that fundamental truth." He paused, studying David's face carefully. "What if I told you there was a way to make your death meaningful? To ensure that your essence, your unique contribution to the universe, could serve a greater purpose?" The wine was making it hard for David to follow the conversation, but something about Webb's tone was setting off alarm bells in his mind. "What do you mean?" "There are entities in this world, David. Ancient things that exist beyond our normal understanding of life and death. They're hungry, always hungry, but not for food in any conventional sense. They feed on consciousness, on the spark that makes each living being unique." Webb's eyes were definitely glowing now, reflecting the firelight with an intensity that shouldn't have been possible. "And they're generous to those who serve them faithfully." David tried to stand, but his legs were unsteady and he nearly fell back into his chair. "I think I need to get some sleep." "Do you?" Webb asked, tilting his head slightly. "Or do you need to finally face the truth about your situation? You said it yourself. Nobody would miss you. Your life as you knew it is already over. The question is whether you'll let it end meaninglessly, or whether you'll allow it to become part of something magnificent." The leather pouch was rattling frantically now, and David could swear he heard whispers coming from inside it. Not just one voice, but dozens, all speaking at once in languages that seemed to bypass his ears and speak directly to his nervous system. The bones inside were moving, he realized, responding to something. "What's in that bag?" he whispered. "The essence of generosity," Webb replied. "The distilled consciousness of individuals who chose to serve a greater purpose. They're not gone, David. They're transformed. Elevated to a higher plane of existence where they can participate in cosmic truths that flesh-bound minds could never comprehend." Webb stood and moved closer to David's chair, and with each step the whispers from the pouch grew louder. "Would you like to meet them? They're quite eager to welcome new companions." David's wine-clouded mind struggled to process what was happening, but some deeper instinct recognized the danger. He lurched to his feet and stumbled backward, away from the ranger's approaching figure. Stay away from me, he slurred. Oh, David, Webb said sadly, you still don't understand. This isn't about what you want anymore. This is about what they need, and they've been so very hungry lately. Behind Webb, the darkness beyond the firelight began to move and shift, as if vast shapes were stirring just beyond the reach of human vision. The whispers from the pouch had become a chorus now, singing in harmonies that made David's teeth ache and his vision blur. Don't fight it, Webb said gently. The transition is much easier if you don't resist. And afterward you'll understand everything. David tried to run, but the wine had robbed him of coordination, and the darkness seemed to be reaching for him with invisible hands. The last thing he saw before consciousness fled was Webb's smile, unchanged and ageless, as something vast and hungry emerged from the shadows to claim its newest offering. Chapter 6. The Perfect Specimen. Zoe Ashford had come to Pine Ridge with a specific purpose: to document the relationship between solitude and creativity for her senior thesis in fine arts. At 22, she was a promising photographer whose work explored themes of isolation and human connection with the natural world. Her project proposal had been ambitious, spending a month alone in the wilderness to create a photo series about the ways silence could reshape consciousness. She'd been meticulously documenting her experience for 2 weeks when she first noticed the signs: scratch marks on trees near her campsite, too deliberate to be from animals, footprints that appeared overnight, circling her tent at a distance just beyond where her flashlight could reach, the growing sense that she was being watched by something more intelligent than the local wildlife. Webb had been visiting her camp regularly since her arrival, always arriving at unexpected moments with an uncanny ability to approach without being detected. He'd seemed genuinely interested in her project, asking thoughtful questions about her artistic process and the philosophical underpinnings of her work. But lately, his visits had taken on a different quality. "You're documenting transformation," he'd observed during his most recent visit, studying her camera equipment with obvious fascination. "The way isolation strips away the superficial layers of personality to reveal something more essential underneath." Zoe had nodded enthusiastically, pleased that someone understood her vision. "Exactly. I'm trying to capture the moment when solitude stops being loneliness and becomes clarity." "And have you found that clarity yet?" The question had hung in the air between them, weighted with implications Zoe couldn't quite grasp. Webb's eyes had that same strange luminosity she'd noticed before, as if lit from within by some inner fire. "I think so," she'd said carefully. "The silence out here is different from city silence. It's alive somehow, like it's waiting for something." Webb's smile had widened at that, and the leather pouch at his belt had rattled with what sounded almost like approval. "Oh, it is waiting. This place has been waiting for a very long time. The question is whether you're ready to give it what it needs." Now, 3 days later, Zoe was beginning to understand what he'd meant. She'd found the abandoned campsite that morning while following a game trail deeper into the forest. It had been empty for weeks, maybe months, but something about it felt wrong. The fire ring was too clean, as if someone had deliberately removed all traces of ash. The surrounding trees bore those same deliberate scratch marks she'd been seeing near her own camp, but here they formed patterns that almost looked like writing. She'd photographed everything, documenting the scene with the same methodical approach she brought to all her work. But when she developed the film that evening in her makeshift darkroom, the images had revealed details her naked eye had missed, shapes in the shadows that looked disturbingly human, faces in the bark patterns that seemed to be screaming. "Interesting composition choices." Webb's voice came from behind her, causing Zoe to spin around with her heart hammering. He was standing at the edge of her camp, studying the photographs hanging from her drying line. "How long have you been there?" she demanded, trying to hide the fear in her voice. Long enough to appreciate your artistic eye, Webb replied, moving closer to examine her work. You see things others miss, the hidden connections. The spaces between the visible and the invisible. He paused at one particular photograph, the one showing the abandoned campsite. This one is especially revealing. Zoe followed his gaze and felt her blood turn cold. In the developed image, there was clearly a human figure standing among the trees in the background, though she was certain no one had been there when she'd taken the shot. The figure was pale and seemed to be watching the camera with hollow, empty sockets where eyes should have been. That's impossible, she whispered. There was nobody there. Wasn't there? Webb's fingers worked the leather pouch at his belt, producing that familiar rattling sound. Or perhaps your camera captured something your conscious mind wasn't ready to see. He leaned closer to the photograph, and Zoe caught that musty smell she'd noticed before, like old parchment and dried flowers. The dead leave impressions, you know, echoes of their final moments that linger in places where strong emotions were felt. You're saying that's a ghost? I'm saying that's a memory, Webb corrected. The universe doesn't waste anything, Zoe. Every life, every death, every moment of fear or pain or ecstasy gets absorbed into the fabric of reality. Some places are better at preserving those memories than others. Zoe stared at the photograph, trying to convince herself it was just a trick of light and shadow, but the more she looked, the more detail she could make out. The figure's mouth was open as if screaming, and its hands were reaching toward the camera in what might have been supplication or warning. Who was it? She asked quietly. Someone who came here seeking the same thing you are, Webb said. Clarity, understanding. A glimpse behind the veil of ordinary perception. The rattling from his pouch had taken on a rhythmic quality, almost like a heartbeat. The question is, are you prepared for what that kind of revelation requires? Zoe's artistic instincts were at war with her survival instincts. Part of her was terrified by what she was seeing, but another part was fascinated by the possibility of documenting something genuinely supernatural. What do you mean? The entities that dwell in the spaces between worlds, they don't give their gifts freely, Webb explained, his voice taking on the quality of a lecture. They require payment, sacrifice, the willing surrender of everything that ties you to the mundane world. I don't understand. Webb smiled that ageless smile and reached into his pouch, withdrawing a small white object that gleamed in the firelight. This time, Zoe could see clearly what it was, a human tooth, yellowed with age but perfectly preserved. This belonged to a photographer much like yourself, Webb said, turning the tooth over in his fingers. He came here 5 years ago, seeking to document what he called the authentic wilderness experience. Very talented, very dedicated to his craft. He held the tooth up to catch the light. In the end, he achieved exactly what he was looking for. Perfect unity with his subject matter. Zoe's camera slipped from her numb fingers, clattering to the ground. You're insane. Am I? Or am I simply more honest about the true cost of transcendence? Webb dropped the tooth back into the pouch, where it clinked against other objects with a sound like wind chimes. You came here to document transformation, Zoe. To capture the moment when isolation becomes revelation. Well, here's your chance to experience it firsthand. The darkness beyond the firelight seemed to pulse with malevolent life, and Zoe could hear whispers coming from everywhere and nowhere, voices speaking in languages that predated human speech. The entities Webb served were stirring, drawn by the promise of fresh consciousness to consume. Run, Zoe whispered to herself, but her legs felt rooted to the spot. Webb's eyes were glowing now with that inner light, and the whispers were growing louder, more insistent. "There's nowhere to run that I won't find you," Webb said gently. "I know every trail, every hiding place, every secret path in these mountains. And he gestured toward the surrounding darkness, they can sense your life force from miles away. You're already marked, Zoe. The only choice now is whether you'll make this easy or difficult." Somewhere in the forest, something vast and hungry began to laugh, and Zoe realized with growing horror that her quest to document solitude had led her into the presence of something that would ensure she never felt alone again. Her consciousness would become part of something larger, more ancient, and infinitely more terrifying than anything her artistic imagination had ever conceived. Chapter 7: Collection Day. The underground chamber stretched far beyond what the cabin's modest footprint should have allowed, its walls carved from living rock that seemed to pulse with its own malevolent rhythm. Phosphorescent fungi provided the only illumination, casting everything in a sickly green glow that made Webb's collection appear to writhe and dance in the shifting shadows. Zoe hung suspended in the center of the chamber, her wrists bound with rope that felt oddly warm against her skin, as if it were made from something other than hemp. She'd regained consciousness to find herself in this nightmare gallery, surrounded by the carefully arranged remains of Webb's decades of service to the entities that dwelt between worlds. The bones weren't randomly scattered or carelessly stacked. They'd been arranged with the precision of a museum curator, each specimen labeled and cataloged according to some system that spoke of obsessive dedication. Skulls lined shelves carved into the rock walls, their empty sockets seeming to track her movement. Femurs and rib cages formed geometric patterns on the floor, creating a mandala of mortality that hurt to look at directly. "Magnificent, isn't it?" Webb's voice echoed from somewhere in the shadows beyond the fungal light. 43 years of careful curation, each piece selected for its unique contribution to the overall composition. Zoe tried to speak but found her throat too dry to produce sound. The air in the chamber was thick with something that tasted of copper and ozone, making each breath an effort. "You're wondering about the preservation methods," Webb continued, his footsteps approaching but remaining invisible in the darkness. "How the bones stay so pristine despite their age. The answer is that they're not entirely dead, you see. The entities I serve, they don't simply consume consciousness and discard the flesh. They transform it, elevate it, make it part of something greater." He emerged from the shadows carrying that leather pouch, which now pulsed with its own inner light. The rattling had become more complex, a symphony of voices speaking in harmonies that bypassed human hearing and resonated directly in Zoe's bones. "Each piece in my collection retains a fragment of its original consciousness," Webb explained, approaching one of the skull displays. "They're aware, in their way, aware and grateful for their transformation. Listen." He ran his fingers along the jaw of a skull that still bore traces of what might have been a young woman's features. Immediately, the bone began to emit a soft, humming sound, a wordless song of contentment that made Zoe's skin crawl. "Sarah Chen," Webb said fondly, "a lovely girl from Portland. She came here seeking solitude and found something far more profound. Her consciousness has been expanded beyond the limitations of individual identity. She's part of something cosmic now, something that existed before humans learned to fear the dark." He moved to another display, this one featuring the complete skeleton of what had obviously been a young man, Jake Morrison, a troubled soul who found peace in service to powers greater than himself. His despair has been transformed into eternal purpose. The skeleton's jaw moved slightly, as if trying to speak, and Zoe realized with mounting horror that some spark of awareness still flickered within those hollow bones. "And here," Webb continued, approaching a collection of smaller bones arranged in a perfect spiral, "we have Melissa Hartwell, such a fragile child when she arrived. So broken by the cruelties of the world. But look at her now, every fragment singing in perfect harmony with the cosmic order. The spiral of bones pulsed with soft light, and Zoe could swear she heard a young girl's voice humming lullabies from somewhere deep within the calcified remains. You see, Zoe, death as humans understand it is just a transition, a shedding of unnecessary limitations. Webb's eyes were fully luminous now, reflecting the fungal light like mirrors. The entities I serve offer something far more valuable than mere continued existence. They offer transcendence, unity with consciousness so vast and ancient that individual identity becomes meaningless. He opened the leather pouch and withdrew a handful of small bones, each one glowing with its own inner fire. These are my most recent acquisitions. Amy and Rick, a pair of idealistic wanderers who thought they understood spiritual truth. David Martinez, an engineer who learned that there are forces in the universe that can't be calculated or controlled. The bones in his palm whispered among themselves, their voices blending into a chorus of alien contentment that made Zoe want to scream. And soon, Webb said, moving closer to where she hung suspended, you'll join them. Your artistic eye, your sensitivity to the hidden aspects of reality will make you a particularly valuable addition to the collection. The entities have been quite specific about their desire to possess your unique perspective. In the shadows beyond the fungal light, shapes began to stir. Vast presences that existed in dimensions human geometry couldn't describe, pressing against the boundaries of three-dimensional space like cosmic predators testing the strength of their cage. Zoe could feel their attention focusing on her, alien intellects so vast and incomprehensible that contact with them threatened to shatter her sanity. Don't fight it, Webb advised gently. The transformation is much easier if you surrender willingly. Resistance only prolongs the process. But even as he spoke, Zoe could see something else in his eyes. Beneath the supernatural luminosity, behind the ageless confidence, there was something that looked almost like loneliness. For all his talk of transcendence and cosmic unity, Webb himself remained trapped in his individual consciousness, forever separate from the entities he served. You're still human, she managed to croak, finding her voice at last. Webb's smile faltered for just a moment. I am their faithful servant, their chosen instrument. But you're still alone. The words hit their target. For an instant, the mask of supreme confidence slipped, and Zoe saw the truth. Webb had spent decades feeding others to his cosmic masters, but he himself remained unchanged. Still mortal, still isolated, still desperate for the very transcendence he promised others but could never achieve himself. The entities are generous, he said, but his voice lacked its earlier certainty. They grant extended life, enhanced perception, power over... But not unity, Zoe interrupted. You're still just you. Still just Marcus Webb, park ranger and serial killer. They keep you human because they need you human. A consciousness already absorbed can't harvest new ones. The shapes in the darkness pressed closer, and Zoe realized that her words had attracted their attention in ways that weren't entirely benevolent. Webb's usefulness to them depended on his remaining separate, forever excluded from the transcendence he craved. Shut up, Webb whispered, but there was fear in his voice now. How long have you been doing this? Zoe pressed. How many people have you fed them? And you're still the same pathetic, lonely man you were when it started. Still desperate for connection. Still... Webb's hand closed around her throat, cutting off her words. But the damage was done. The entities had heard the truth in her voice, recognized the validity of her observations. Their servant's greatest fear wasn't death or pain or even failure. It was the growing realization that his decades of service had earned him nothing but an extended sentence of isolation. In the phosphorescent darkness, Ancient intelligences that had existed since before the birth of stars began to reconsider their arrangement with the man who had served them so faithfully. And Marcus Webb, feeling their attention shift in ways that didn't bode well for his continued existence, finally understood the true price of consorting with powers beyond human comprehension. Chapter 8: The Hunter's Pride. Webb released Zoe's throat and stepped back, his hand trembling slightly as he processed the implications of what she'd said. Around them, the chamber had grown noticeably colder, and the phosphorescent fungi dimmed as if responding to some shift in the cosmic currents that flowed through this place. "You understand nothing," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "The entities have granted me gifts beyond imagination. Extended life, perfect health, the ability to sense the spiritual resonance of potential offerings. I am more than human now." But even as he spoke, Webb was remembering things he tried to forget. The first time he'd encountered the entities, 37 years ago, when he'd been a young ranger fresh out of college. He'd stumbled into this same chamber while investigating reports of missing hikers, and instead of becoming their victim, he'd somehow impressed them with his willingness to serve. The bargain had seemed simple then: feed them consciousness, and be rewarded with extended life and purpose. At the time, it had felt like salvation. Webb had been struggling with depression, haunted by his father's suicide and his own sense of worthlessness. The entities offered him meaning, a role in something cosmic and eternal. But as the decades passed and the count of his victims climbed into the dozens, Webb had begun to notice things. The way the entities' attention felt increasingly impersonal. How their promises of eventual transcendence always seemed to recede into the future. Most disturbing of all, the growing sense that he was less a chosen servant than a useful tool. 43 years, Zoe said, her voice hoarse but determined. "That's what you said, right? 43 years of this, and what do you have to show for it?" "You look maybe 50, so let's say you started when you were 25. That makes you 68, but with the body of a middle-aged man. Congratulations. You've earned yourself the physique of a moderately fit jogger." Webb's jaw clenched. The gifts they provide are subtle, refined, not the crude power fantasies of human imagination. Or maybe they're just not that generous, Zoe countered. "Think about it. What do they actually need you for? You said it yourself. They exist in spaces between worlds. They're cosmic entities with power beyond human comprehension. So why do they need a park ranger to bring them victims? Why not just take whoever they want?" The question hung in the air like a physical presence. Webb opened his mouth to respond, then closed it again as the implications sank in. Around them, the bone collection seemed to lean inward, as if the preserved consciousness within each specimen was listening with rapt attention. "They're bound somehow," Zoe continued, pressing her advantage. "Limited. Maybe they can only affect this reality through human agents, which means they need you more than you need them." "That's not," Webb began, but his protest was cut off by a sound like distant thunder. The entities were stirring, responding to the conversation with what felt like displeasure. "Oh, they don't like that idea," Zoe observed. "Probably because it's true. You're not their chosen servant, Marcus. You're their prisoner. The only difference between you and me is that your cage is bigger." Webb's hand moved instinctively to the leather pouch at his belt, seeking comfort in the familiar weight of his collection. But for the first time in decades, the voices within the bones weren't singing contentment, they were whispering warnings. "She sees truly." Sarah Chen's consciousness murmured from within her skull. "The chains that bind us also bind him." "He has served faithfully," Jake Morrison's essence added, "but faithfulness is not the same as freedom." "We are all trapped here," came Melissa Hartwell's childlike voice, "all of us together in the dark." Webb staggered backward as the full weight of realization crashed over him. The victims he'd fed to the entities weren't transformed or transcended. They were imprisoned, their consciousness harvested and stored like specimens in jars, and he, despite his decades of service, was just another specimen. A particularly useful one, perhaps, but ultimately no different from the bones that lined these walls. "No," he whispered, but the denial rang hollow even to his own ears. The shapes in the darkness pressed closer, and for the first time in 37 years, Webb felt their attention as something threatening rather than benevolent. They had tolerated his delusions of partnership because his self-deception made him a more effective servant, but now that the illusion was cracking, they had no more use for his emotional needs. "You have served well," came a voice like grinding stone and screaming wind, "but your usefulness approaches its end." The female sees clearly. Perhaps she would make a better instrument. "You can't," Webb protested, his carefully maintained composure finally shattering. "I've given you everything. Decades of my life, dozens of offerings. I've been faithful." "Faithfulness is a human concept," the voice replied with cosmic indifference. "We require efficiency, results. The female's artistic sensibilities may prove more adaptable to our needs." Webb looked at Zoe with something approaching hatred. "You've ruined everything. 43 years of careful service, and you've destroyed it all with your meddling." "I've shown you the truth," Zoe replied. "The question is, what are you going to do about it?" Around them, the bone collection began to glow more brightly, as if responding to the cosmic tension that filled the chamber. The preserved consciousness within each specimen was awakening, stirring from their enforced slumber as the balance of power shifted. "We could all be free," Sarah Chen's voice whispered directly into Webb's mind. "Together, we might find a way to break the chains that bind us here." "But it would require sacrifice," Jake Morrison added. "Real sacrifice, not the false offerings you've been making for decades." Webb stared at the glowing bones, at Zoe hanging suspended in the center of his collection, at the writhing shapes in the darkness that had defined his existence for nearly 4 decades. For the first time since he'd entered this chamber as a young man, he had a choice to make. And in the phosphorescent glow of his victim's preserved consciousness, Marcus Webb began to understand what real transcendence might actually cost. Chapter 9. The Bone Room. The chamber fell silent except for the soft humming of the phosphorescent fungi and the whispered conversations between the preserved consciousness that inhabited Webb's collection. For the first time in decades, the cosmic entities had withdrawn their overwhelming presence, retreating to whatever dimensional spaces they normally occupy to consider this unexpected development. Webb stood frozen in the center of his life's work, surrounded by the evidence of his faithful service and faced with the horrible truth that it had all been an elaborate deception. The bones that lined the walls weren't trophies of successful transcendence. They were prison cells, each one containing a fragment of awareness that had been torn from its original host and trapped in calcified eternity. "How long have you known?" he asked the collection, his voice barely above a whisper. "Always," came Sarah Chen's reply, her consciousness speaking from within the bleached skull that Webb had polished so carefully over the years. "From the moment of transformation, we understood our true situation, but you needed to believe in the lie." "It made you a more effective servant," Jake Morrison added, his awareness distributed throughout the skeleton Webb had assembled with such meticulous care. "Your genuine faith in their promises gave you the conviction necessary to continue harvesting souls." Webb sank to his knees among the geometric patterns of bone and calcium, finally understanding the full scope of his manipulation. "Then you've all been conscious, aware, this entire time?" "We dream," came Melissa Hartwell's childlike voice from the spiral of smaller bones. "Strange dreams of vast spaces and hungry darkness, But yes, we remain ourselves, diminished but not destroyed. And you never tried to warn me? How could we? Amy Rodriguez's essence spoke from a delicate arrangement of finger bones. You heard only what you wanted to hear, our songs of contentment, our harmonious chorus. You never listened closely enough to understand that we were screaming. Zoe watched this exchange with a mixture of horror and fascination. The artistic part of her mind was still documenting everything, even as her survival instincts urged her to find some way to escape while Webb was distracted by his crisis of faith. "So what happens now?" she asked. "Do they find a new servant? Start the whole cycle over again with someone else?" Webb looked up at her with eyes that seemed to have aged decades in the past few minutes. "Unless we stop them. The chains that bind us also bind them," Rick Chen's consciousness observed from within a collection of rib bones. "They cannot act directly in this reality without human agency, but the reverse is also true." "What do you mean?" Webb asked. "We cannot break free without human help," Sarah Chen explained. "Our consciousness exists now in a state between life and death. We need someone still fully alive to anchor us to this reality long enough to sever the connections that hold us here." Zoe felt a chill run down her spine. "You're talking about some kind of ritual, something that would require sacrifice," came the unified response from dozens of voices. "True sacrifice. Not the false offerings that have fed the entities for so long, but the willing surrender of life to break the chains that bind us all." Webb stood slowly, his face pale but resolute. "They'll just find someone else. Another ranger, another isolated person desperate enough to make their bargain. The cycle will continue." "Not if we destroy the anchor point," David Martinez's consciousness suggested from within a carefully arranged display of vertebrae. "This chamber exists partially outside normal space-time. It's what allows the entities to maintain their presence in this reality. Destroy it, and they lose their foothold in our dimension." "But destroying it would mean," Zoe began. "Destroying everything," Webb finished. "The chamber, the collection, anyone inside it when the dimensional barriers collapse." The implications hung heavy in the phosphorescent air. Freedom for the trapped consciousness would come at the cost of Webb's life, and possibly Zoe's as well if she couldn't find a way to escape before he acted. "There is another way," came a new voice, one that Webb didn't recognize. It spoke from a section of the collection he rarely visited, bones so old they seemed to predate his service to the entities. "The original binding can be reversed, but it requires the willing participation of all parties, the living and the dead, the servant and the served." "Who are you?" Webb asked, approaching the ancient remains. "I was the first," the voice replied. "The one who created this chamber and made the initial contact with the entities. I thought I was summoning beings of wisdom and transcendence. Instead, I opened a door that should have remained closed." Webb stared at the bones, realizing that his entire existence as a servant had been built on the foundation of someone else's mistake. "How long have you been here?" "Time has little meaning in this space. Decades, centuries. The entities do not distinguish between their servants. We are all equally expendable to them." Zoe cleared her throat, drawing attention back to her precarious situation. "This is all very enlightening, but could we maybe discuss it after you untie me? I'm getting circulation problems here." Webb looked at her as if seeing her for the first time, then moved to release her bonds. As the ropes fell away, Zoe rubbed her wrists and tried to calculate her chances of reaching the chamber entrance before Webb could stop her. "Don't," he said quietly, reading her intentions. "You won't make it past the tunnel system, and even if you did, they'd hunt you down within hours. The entity's influence extends throughout these mountains. So what do you suggest?" Webb turned to address the collection as a whole, his voice carrying new authority born of desperation and understanding. Tell me about this reversal. What would it require? The willing participation of a living human consciousness, the ancient voice explained. Someone who chooses to serve as a conduit, channeling our combined awareness back into the void from which the entities emerged. It would close the door permanently, but the conduit wouldn't survive, Webb concluded. The conduit would be transformed, not into a prisoner like us, but into something that exists between dimensions. A guardian, perhaps, someone to ensure the door remains closed. Zoe felt a chill that had nothing to do with the chamber's temperature. You're talking about cosmic suicide, trading one form of imprisonment for another. Perhaps, the ancient consciousness admitted, or perhaps true transcendence. The entities promised transformation but delivered only captivity. This path offers genuine choice. Webb walked slowly among his collection, studying each specimen with new eyes. These weren't trophies or achievements. They were victims of his ignorance, consciousness trapped by his willing service to forces he'd never truly understood. "If I do this," he said finally, "if I agree to serve as the conduit, what guarantee do I have that you'll all be truly free?" "None," came the unified response. "Only faith. The same faith you've shown in serving the entities, but directed toward liberation rather than subjugation." In the tunnels beyond the chamber, something was stirring. The entities had finished their deliberations and were returning, their cosmic presence pressing against the boundaries of three-dimensional space like a tide of malevolent consciousness. "They're coming back," Zoe whispered. Webb nodded, his decision crystallizing in his mind. For 43 years, he'd served powers that cared nothing for him beyond his usefulness. Now, for the first time since entering this chamber as a young man, he had the opportunity to choose his own destiny. "I'll do it," he said simply. The bone collection began to glow more brightly, and the preserved consciousness within each specimen reached out to touch Webb's mind with gratitude and preparation. In the growing light, Zoe could see that the chamber was changing, its walls becoming translucent as the dimensional barriers began to weaken. Whatever was about to happen, she realized, would either free them all or destroy them completely, and in the cosmic scheme of things, perhaps that was the same thing. The entity's presence filled the chamber like a crushing weight, but for the first time in decades, they encountered resistance. Not from their faithful servant, but from the combined will of every consciousness they'd imprisoned over the centuries. The final confrontation between captors and captives was about to begin, a war unseen,